Welcome to this oral history interview, part of the developing series of interviews focusing on live music venues and experiences on Route 66, centered around Springfield and Greene County, Missouri, and Lebanon and Pulaski County, Missouri. This series is supported in part by a grant from the Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program of the National Park Service. My name is Craig Amason with Missouri State University Libraries. Today's date is April 14th, 2022. And our special guest today is Earl Coleman, an accomplished musician and vocalist with an illustrious career as a performer and a teacher. He retired from Columbus State University in Georgia, where he served as Curry Eminent Faculty Scholar Chair and Dean. He has taught in various institutions around the country, including the University of Missouri. This interview is taking place in the Duane G. Meyer Library on the campus of Missouri State University. Earl, thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this project and for coming here today to talk with us.
Thank you.
And I want to ask, first of all, did I get all of that correct?
You did.
Good. First question is going to be a real tough one. When and where were you born?
April 10th, 1947, at City Hospital in Springfield, Missouri.
Right here in Springfield.
Yep.
I know you graduated from Parkview High School in 1965, but that was only the final school you attended before heading off to college. Describe what it was like growing up in Springfield in the 1950s and 60s.
Well, I was a student at Lincoln School, which was the all African American school for 2 years. And schools integrated my first grade year. And they were going to close Lincoln after my second grade year, and so my mother wanted my brother to go to the school. He's a year younger, Larry Coleman, go to the school that the family had attended. So we both went to, so I went 2 years, then I went to Campbell School, then Jarrett Junior High, then Parkview. And when I was at Parkview, there were probably 12 or 15 African Americans. But I felt very included. I did not feel excluded. But I think, as my other African American friends have said to me, two who went to SMS and have their doctorates and education, said it was very different for them than it was for me because I was in the arts.
And how did that difference? I mean, why was it different?
Because in general, and they've stated, one's a psychologist, that artists are more open-minded and accepting, and they accept you for your abilities.
And that would be both the students and the and the instructors.
Right.
What memories do you have about being in school?
Well, I have some very good ones and some not so good ones. Matter of fact, on Facebook recently, someone asked, "Do you remember your fifth grade teacher?" And I wrote, "Yes, I do. She was a bigot." And there were three of us, three African Americans, and she had us all right together on one side of the room, and the room was like this. And she'd ask a question, and all three of us, the two women are two of the smartest people I've ever known. One has her doctorate. We'd raise our hands, and she'd look the other way. And so so on Facebook, I didn't put her name, and my other friend said, "Was that Mrs. E?" Yes, yeah. So, but on the other hand, in the fifth grade, I met the man who would start me in music, Ellis Thurman. And he was my teacher from fifth grade through my junior year. He had a heart attack at a football game. He was the band director. But I go back and read what he wrote in my yearbook, and it can bring me to tears, because you as a kid, you just think he's just writing this stuff. But now I know he was really encouraging me that you can do this.
Wow. Yeah. You were exposed to music from birth. I mean, I know your father was a singer during World War II.
Right.
You started playing piano when you were about 8 years old. Is that correct?
Where'd you get all this?
I'm a librarian. And the church must have presented an early opportunity for musical expression. Gibson Chapel.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I can tell you two sides of that. I started playing piano in third grade, and my grandmother got me a piano. She also got my violin later. And one of my early memories is just playing hymns. And I was out playing baseball actually, one day with some friends, and my uncle, who was a jazz musician, Dallas Bartley, brought me in. We had to play piano with this horrible trumpet player, who was the uncle of my close friends, Miles Davis. What did I know? It was wasting my time.
I almost wanted to ask you to say that again.
So that was that. And then in the church, my father was a Baptist and my mother's a Presbyterian. And he attended Washington Avenue Baptist Church and she Gibson Chapel Presbyterian Church. And so we'd have to go to Sunday school at one church and walk 2 blocks to church at the other. So we had an ecumenical upbringing. And then when we were in high school, I decided the Presbyterian was the route that I would go. And one of my mentors was Mrs. Holly Allen, who was the minister's wife and later a teacher at Central High School, history teacher. But she set us up, we all say, the 7 or 8 of us in my class, that she set us up for life. For instance, I went to an international Presbyterian youth conference that I didn't want to go to, but back then, and I did it as a teacher, I don't ask kids if they'll do something, I tell them they'll do it. And you're going to this conference. And I came back from this wonderful conference, was at Purdue, and you can imagine in 1964, summer of 64, how amazing that would be for a kid. And we're kids from all over the world. And then we came back, and then I had to make a speech in front of our presbytery, which had helped send the kids. And, I wouldn't have been in public speaking. I wouldn't have been in plays. It was just, she said you were going to do it. You just did it. And that was that whole group of us. I put something on Facebook about her a few weeks ago, and even kids 10 years younger than I realized how important she was to us. Along with our families, which were very supportive. But, at that age, you don't want to talk to your family. And to have this other person, and I can remember stopping by her house after our youth group and talking for 2 or 3 hours. And so you made it was like a second mother.
Well, obviously, you talk about extended family. Your grandmother provided you with musical instruments.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes, my father's mother, yes.
Yeah, so you had support beyond just your...
Right. Well, and the other thing is our elementary school principal, at the end of 4th grade, we took some test. And within the last 3 years, I've connected to probably 7 to 8 people that went to elementary school. And she did the same thing for all of us. She called her parents and said, her name is Mrs. Wallace, Earl is going to play violin. If you can't afford a violin, we'll get it. My friend Don plays cello. My other friend Don played trombone. And we all thought we were the only ones. And so she was really the one that, and then I wasn't going to play violin. And my friend Don, Don Keaton, recently graduated, got a Hall of Fame athletic award here in Springfield and taught at Drury for a while. And we were 4th grade, and I said, I'm not going to play that violin. And he said, well, if you play the violin, we'll get out of math. I said, sign me up. And so how one step in your life can make the difference through the rest of your life. And then having Mr. Thurman as a teacher, and then family encouragement.
I think that's the first time I've ever heard somebody saying get it out of math class. It changed their life.
And I tested out of math in college, so so I did do well in math.
Get it. Okay, I have to go back to Miles Davis. Ever an encounter with him, ever?
No, but I met his nephew and his nieces, of course, I knew very, very extensively. And I just watched recently a documentary on Netflix about him and how tortured life, what a genius he was, but what a tortured life he lived. And my uncle, Dallas Bartley, was a jazz musician and had grew up in Springfield, started his own band, and then went to Chicago and started a band, then played with Louis Jordan and Billie Holiday. He was in New York and all of that. Then came back, he had health issues, and then started in his 50s college classes at SMS. But that was also, he lived with us, so that was also, I would hear these jazz musicians would come to our home and we would, experience those kinds of things.
Wow, that's just, I wasn't expecting that.
Well, and even before that, and doing family heritage, I had an uncle, great uncle, who grew up, my grandmother's brother grew up in Cave Springs, Missouri, which is near Willard.
Okay.
And he was a musician and played piano, and he had Pike's Hounds or something like that. There are pictures in some of the archives of this group.
Yes.
And one of the funniest stories is my brother and I went down to Cave Springs to go to the family graveyard. And we were walking back, and there's this little white man sitting on a porch, and he waved us to, he said, pointed at me, he said, "You're a Pike. You walk just like Ray Pike," who died in the 30s. So it's all this, kind of,
A little spooky, right?
Right. Yeah.
You're almost answering this next question, but at what age did you realize you had musical talent that exceeded your peers?
I don't think it exceeded my peers. I think we had a very competitive group of students, academically and musically. Mm-hmm. And for instance, in orchestra, I had the same stand partner, Katie Keene, who's one of my best friends, from 7th grade all the way through 12th grade. She was always 1, I was always 2. And she quit violin in college. She stopped. But that was my motivation. That was my, so there's always one better. And then I got to MU, and my freshman year, they had a concerto competition, and there were 6 of us, 4 graduate students, a senior, and Earl. And when that happened, I said, well, maybe I can do this. Because, in my family, it was always, do the best you can. But my mother used to say, if you're good, you don't have to tell anybody. They'll know it.
Yes.
You don't have to take that route. And so I was always very humble about it. But at that point, I thought, well, maybe I can do this. And then I was concertmaster for 4 years at the university. And so just, it built as you went along. But it's a field that you're your competition. Mm-hmm. If you're trying to compete with somebody else, I tell my students, you've already lost the game.
Interesting.
Because there's always going to be somebody better. You just have to make yourself the best person you can be.
It sounds like you evolved from being motivated by others to being self-motivated.
Right. And part of it is my mother used to say, pick your friends carefully. That was always her thing. And my brother and I both laugh now because she was so right. Because I had friends who were motivated. They were going to go to college. They were going to get an education. And my mother put us in working in junior high. And I'll never forget, 2 things made me know I was going to get a college education. Bussing tables at the Colonial Hotel, mm-hmm. and caddying at Hickory Hills Country Club, mm-hmm. in 7th and 8th and 9th grade. So after that, I knew I'm not going to do this the rest of my life.
We're going to get back to the Colonial Hotel too. I promise. We're going to go back there. There was a teacher, I think, in your sophomore year in high school that really encouraged you too. Joan Burris Saltz, is that correct?
Boy, you did your research. Good for you.
Can you tell us a little bit about her?
She was wonderful. I was in the high school orchestra, and again, one of my best friends was a year older, and she was studying with her, and I needed a violin teacher, and so I went, and she said she would take me, and very highly motivating. And then my senior year, she said, you need a new violin. And my mother said, we can't afford violin, and lessons. So my senior year, she taught me for free.
Oh, wow.
And I still have, she gave me, her oldest daughter had graduated from MU and had come home, and she gave me a trunk to take to college, which I still have. And recently her next oldest daughter and I've connected back on Facebook, and she lives here in Springfield. So she was very influential in not only teaching me violin, but making me be able to do the violin, because I couldn't have, you need a good instrument, but you have to also have lessons, and so I was able to, just because of her graciousness.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
I should also give Tracie a tremendous amount of credit here for the research, because when I read the material, she's largely the one who looked at it all up. So.
Okay.
Newspapers.com is fantastic.
Yes, it is. It's your friend. So that brings me to something else we found. Tell me about the Singing Strings from way back in the day.
That was a all-string group of select students at Parkview at that time. And I was in it my junior and senior year, and there were only two boys, the bass player and Earl.
And tell me what you all did. I mean,
We would play, there's a picture I have of us playing at the Kentwood Arms on stage, you know, for banquets and parties and civic events to get out to the community.
yeah. And who was the sponsor? What teacher was the sponsor?
Well, our orchestra teacher, Mr. Thurman, before he died, then Dan Palin after,
Okay.
but it was really a self-run group.
And so you got gigs from time to time,
Right.
or regularly?
Well, regularly, because it was an ambassador. If there was some meeting at the school, we would play for it. You know, if there was something at a church, we would go. So we were ambassadors for the school.
Kentwood Arms. Any other places you can remember you played specifically?
Hickory Hills, First and Calvary Presbyterian Church, South Christian Church. I remember that. Usually places where we were members in the group. You know, the parents would want us to play for their events.
Makes sense, yeah. You were playing with the Springfield Symphony when you were only 17 years old. Is that correct?
They brought gifted kids into the orchestra, and I was the first African American to play in the orchestra in my senior year, and it was a great experience, you know. And they shifted seating for each concert, so you got to sit with different people. And Joanne Saltz, my teacher, was the principal second violin. So that was, and I was in the second violin, so that was neat too, to be in an orchestra with her.
Did she help get you in that position, or how did that go?
You have to audition before
Okay.
board, and I'm sure she had her say in, you know, in if you got in or not, you know. That didn't hurt.
Yeah, but this was something you wanted to do.
Oh, yes.
This, in other words, no adult was saying you're going to do this.
Right, exactly. That's what she said. I think you should audition for this.
That's fascinating, especially to be the first African American member of that symphony. Any intimidation?
Oh no, it was very, very what's the word I want to use? It's not inspiring. For instance, my junior year, before I went into the symphony, I got the principal second chair in the youth symphony. And Bill DeLange, whose daughter was a phenomenal violinist, and both his boys played in the orchestra. And he was a businessman, but played in the symphony. And he came up to me and said, "I am so proud of you. You're doing a great job." You know, again, didn't have to say that. And recently I had a note on Facebook from Patrice Lockhart. Dr. Lockhart was a doctor in town. His wife played violin in the orchestra. And she said, "I can remember as an 8-year-old how kind you were to me when I'd come to the youth symphony to rehearsal." She had to come with her mom every week because her brother was in the orchestra. You know, and so you make these connections again. And I was thinking, how did I get to know her? She's so much younger. And then when she said that, that's how.
Interesting.
You know.
Your uncle, you mentioned earlier, Dallas Bartley, was an incredible jazz musician. Was that your mother's brother?
Yes.
Is that correct? Did you play with him in Springfield?
Oh, no. Matter of fact, one of my brother's friends said they used to call me Beethoven because I was the classical musician. But when I got to college, I realized I could make money playing piano bar. And so I started playing jazz and singing my own. And then when I came home, he had a trio, and I went out and I'd go sit in with them. And these old timers were playing all kinds of tricks to see if this kid thinks he can sing this music. You know, they change keys, they change rhythms, but I hung in there.
So singing is what you were doing.
Right.
With them, correct? Yeah.
Yep.
Got it.
Yep. And then I'd go hear. I was interested in it, and by that time I was old enough to go to clubs and hear them performing.
Do you recall some of the clubs?
You know, I cannot. I can tell you where they are. I can't tell you what they're. There was a guy named Bebop Brown,
Brown.
that had a club. And that was I'd arrived when I was old enough to go to this club.
Supposed to be quite a club.
Yeah.
Right.
We've read quite a bit about bebop.
Right.
Yes.
And then my next door neighbor, my last year of high school, was a man named David Bedell, who was a drummer. And he was a mentor to many kids in Springfield. And so with my uncle and bebop, they'd come into our house, or we'd next door and rehearse. And so we'd get to hear them. And there was a white pianist that had gone to Drury College named Bob Betts, blind, that played with them. And it was just fascinating for me to just think, this man is phenomenal, and he's learned this all by orally, not by sight.
Yeah. Were they touring outside Springfield at that time?
But they did play in St. Louis in Gaslight Square, I know that for sure. But because of my uncle's health issues, he really wasn't doing a lot outside of the community.
Okay. Did you ever go outside with them at all, outside of Springfield?
No, we weren't allowed. My mother would never. Never.
She was helping you choose this one.
Right.
So you mentioned the Colonial Hotel. You were working there.
I was a busboy. We had one of my mentors at church was our organist, and Florence Thompson, and she taught math at Jarrett Junior High when I was there. And as I was growing older, and her daughters were my mother's best friends, my mother said I needed a job, and her husband was probably in his late 60s or 70s. He seemed old then. Mr. Job Thompson was an African-American man who was over all of the kitchen and the busboys and the waiters and all of that. And that's how I got that job.
Do you remember hearing music there?
You know, I was so busy bussing tables, and I just wanted to get out of there.
Right.
You know, really, I don't.
You don't recall
No.
any of those?
No,
Any memories of the rendezvous room?
not really.
Nothing?
Because I was not old enough to go to those places yet.
Right, yeah.
I do have a memory, the other memory of my uncle, Paul Bartley, owned a pool hall. And it was in near Jones Alley, which is right off of, I think it's Pythian, right off of, you go over Martin Luther King Bridge, and there's Pitts Chapel Church, and then down there, where the black community owned, my cousin owned a barber shop, my uncle had a pool, there was an apartment complex, then there was a place called Jones Alley, where I remember going to nursery school. But he owned a pool hall. And men would come in, and I'd have to clean up, you know, and that kind of thing, and hearing them talk about these places.
Yeah.
And then my mother worked for a while at Grimm's Barbecue, which was the only, you know, really was the stellar African-American place, and they had motels. And so if you were coming Route 66, there was a Green Book, and that was one of the places to stay. And I would go, you know, help her, not go to help, we were forced. We went to work, cleaning cabins and helping serve food and those kind of, which now my brother and I laugh, I mean, you couldn't have a better experience, you know, having those memories. And people, you know, would come through town, like Ella Fitzgerald I met, because they would stay at these places and they would eat. And also in our home, because my uncle was a musician, when people would come to town, they would go to African-American homes to be, you know, to socialize.
Did they stay in African-American homes as well, like overnight?
Yep, some did.
Yeah.
But there was Grimm's Barbecues, then there was a place on Central, near the old city hospital. And
Was it Alberta?
yes,
Yes.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And I remember going there to eat as a family,
Uh-huh.
you know, those kind of places.
She was quite an entrepreneur.
Right, right.
Yeah.
She and Mr. and Mrs. Grimm, I think those were the three
Yeah.
people that really spearheaded that community.
Sure. Remember any other celebrities that came through?
Ray Charles, I met.
Yeah.
Count Basie, Duke Ellington. I mean, because that's what they did when they toured. And because my uncle was a musician and they knew them, you know, they just were it's a community.
Any memories about those people at all?
Well, when you're a kid, you're just old people. Like I am now. So when kids don't want to have anything to do with me, I understand, There was a woman, though, Jean Trevor, who had a career in St. Louis. And by the time I was interested in it then, and having talks with her, and she was a performer on Gaslight Square in St. Louis, and learning how difficult it was to have a career, especially as a black woman, to have a career, and for any woman, matter of fact, at that point.
Right.
So she gave me a lot of lessons about, you're always prepared, don't go to any gig unprepared.
You got to be 100%.
Right, you got to be 110 if you're African American. You've got to be better, and that was always the thing we were getting, and that's a hard thing for a kid to have to carry, And once I learned I can only be the best that I can be, I can't be better than what I can be. Instead of trying to, because if you have that, you're always trying to be better. To the same, it can create psychological things, and I've seen that in students. You've seen that in students. They're their own worst enemies.
That was going to be my question. Hearing something like that from Ms. Trevor could either make you discouraged that I'm never going to be able to do this, or it could inspire you to say, I am going to do this.
Right, exactly.
Obviously, you
Right.
leaned over on that.
Well, and mine was always, I think it's a God thing for me. And I tell my students, opportunity meets preparation. If you're not prepared and the opportunity comes, I don't care who you are, you're not going to get the gig. But if you're prepared when and that's what I was. When those things came along, I was prepared to do them. So I think that made the difference, just being prepared as best you can. And then when the opportunities came, and going to the University of Missouri, another God thing, one of my friends in high school was a violinist named Jeannie Cole, and her father owned Cole's clothing store. And he played in the symphony. And he was taking her up to audition right before her senior year, and it would have been for my junior year. And he said, he was a Presbyterian, we'd like you to go with us. And so I went to Columbia and auditioned and was offered a scholarship my junior year and I would have never known to even do that, I thought it was going to go here in town, that I wasn't even thinking about going away to school.
Yeah, you were interviewed when you were 17, and you were talking about going to school.
you saw that
and the
article.
places, and the places you mentioned in the article are not places you went.
Right, exactly.
That's
University of Tulsa,
Yeah,
Maryville, I remember that. You are good, guys.
She's an archivist. I just read it. She's an archivist. That's fascinating. So, can you tell us anything about the live music scene in Springfield during the time you were here? Do you remember, other than what you've already told us?
Really, that was kind of a transitionary period because, I had kids I went to school with whom I went to school, were in the Ozark Mountain Daredevils. Kids so we were that transitionary. Nobody was really, there was the jazz people and those old people, and then there was the new people. And of course, I was so concentrated on classical music that, I liked jazz, but when I had to make money doing it, that's when I really learned it and got into it. And I had a friend, he was actually from Lebanon, and he went on to play with Buddy Rich and Stan Kent. His name was Jim Widener, and he had a band. He ended up at the University of St. Louis and just recently died, but we met in the Springfield Youth Symphony. And then when I got to MU, he asked me to play some gigs with violin, and then got me more interested in jazz. And so I was going out hearing people mainly in Columbia. At that period, I was away from home. But when I'd come home, I'd hear bebop and go those kinds of places. And the other thing was, if you don't have a lot of money, you're not going to go a lot of places. Well,
Were the Ozark Mountain Daredevils like was everybody in their shadow, or were they just part of the scene? Or
I think they became a very big part of the scene. And again, I was in college when this was all
Right.
happening, but we'd gone to high school together. And of course, they're still around as a new group, but they're still
right.
doing their thing,
Were you in touch with them at all after you left Springfield?
This is funny, no. And a few years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago, friends of mine's daughter had studied with me in Georgia, and she grew up at the lake. And they asked me to surprise her. She was coming in from Maryland to christen their daughter, and if I would play. And they said, and we've got a pianist in our church that'll play for you. And so I came in that morning, and he said, "Mr. Coleman?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, Bud Brayfield. I said, Buddy Brayfield that lived on Grant Street that went to Campbell School. He was in the Ozark Mountain Daredevils. And so here we are in Osage Beach, Missouri, and haven't seen him. His sister used to run off and leave him, and I'd walk him to school because I was a few years older. And here he's a doctor now. And he was one of my friends, good friends, and so we've kept in touch since then. So that was, like going way back in time to elementary school.
Gosh.
But I think we all have the 6 degrees of separation, and that's why my friends say, everybody. I said, no, I said, I ask people questions. And if you ask people questions, you'll find commonality. But if you don't, you'll never find those links.
Sure. Any other musicians from Springfield that you've kept up with or met again?
One of my friends, Nancy McElhaney, we've stayed in touch all the way. I mean, I've been in her wedding, her sister's weddings, and she's a violinist. She was a concertmaster of the New York City Opera Orchestra and plays in the New York City Ballet. And I just rented her condo in Florida for a month. So and I stayed with her at Christmas, so we are still friends.
You all collaborated on a project here in Springfield.
Yes, we did.
Not too terribly long ago. Is that
Right.
correct?
Well, her son is now 30 years old, and he wasn't born then.
Oh, yeah. Gosh. It didn't seem like, when I was reading, it didn't seem like
Right.
what am I to say?
But you may have seen the thing her younger sister and I did with the symphony. We sang with the symphony. And but that was, again, a while ago, because her kids are out of college now.
Wow.
Time just passes. But those 3 McElhaney sisters, Mary Ann is the middle, Nancy the oldest, and the youngest, we've stayed together. And one thing we've realized since being older was in the late 60s, well, mid-60s, Nancy's a couple of years younger, and we were playing we'd go to her church, the white church, and play. And we'd go to my grandmother's church, the black church, and my church, that our mothers were putting us out there. We didn't know, we were just playing violin. But we didn't know the kind of social justice things they were doing by presenting us together, and their mother played for us. So that was
Very intentional.
I think our parents was, and their parents were both from South Carolina, and I was always welcomed in their home and never felt any kind of angst. And as adults, I've said to them, I never felt any kind of discrimination or anything. And they said, well, our mother's greatest fear is that some of her relatives from the South would come and say something that would offend you. And it never happened. So that was I was part of the culture at school and accepted. And, I learned it's not a popularity contest. You just do your thing and let it speak for yourself. If you don't want to be my friend, that's fine. You go through the age where you want to be like everybody, but then you get over that and say, that's your issue, not mine.
And you may not know the answer to these questions, but they're questions that we feel obligated to ask as part of this project. About acts that were coming into Springfield. We're curious to know, was it common for large acts or bands from around the country to appear in Springfield? Like, for instance, with playing with your uncle, did acts from the outside come in?
Yeah, I think people like Ellington and Basie, they would. I think the problem with Springfield is you have Kansas City and St. Louis. So they're going to go where the money is.
Right.
But again, if you had, if a promoter had a gig for you in St. Louis and you could come to Springfield the next night and play, then leave, that kind of thing. And I think those kind of acts were through here. But, again, I was not really into that.
Right. And the audiences, do you think the audiences were mostly Springfield area audiences or further away? Did people come into?
Well, I know people came in, African Americans came in from Carthage and Lebanon, Joplin, Neosho. Those communities I know because my family had friends. And we'd get together, they would be in town, they'd come over and see us, and relatives, that kind of thing. So I know that drew people in.
For shows that were
Yes,
going on. Yeah,
right. And especially during segregation, because that would be a big deal, to get to see them.
Sure.
And I don't know about venues because, I grew up right at the time of change.
Right.
And so all I hear, are hearsay, and my father's family is from southern Arkansas, which was quite different than growing up in Springfield. And I remember going from Springfield to Little Rock, and we got on the bus, and I was probably 8 years old, so it had to be mid 53 or 54. And we were sitting right behind the driver, and we got to Little Rock, and we were told we had to go to the back of the bus. And I was getting ready to leave, and my grandmother just pushed me back. Didn't say a word.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily, she had a bus driver who was evidently, okay, this is fine. Because you could have had somebody who would drag you off.
Right.
It could have been the other scenario.
Sure.
But I remember that, and I remember going to her community, El Dorado, Arkansas, and seeing colored, water fountains. And I'd never experienced that until I went there.
Nothing like that in Springfield when you were coming on?
There were. I remember my third or fourth grade year. I was at the Landers Theater, and my friend Don, Saturday morning cartoons and kids shows, and he said this is the time that he lost his innocence. I was at the candy counter. He's white, and he was my best friend, and he said, come sit downstairs with me. And I said, I can't. And he said, I'll come and sit upstairs with you. And I said, you can't. And I remember that. And then we had to go up the outside. You buy your tickets and you'd go up outside. There was like the fire escape.
Okay.
Go up and you'd go in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And but then the next year, everything. For instance, we lived near Fast Night Park. And I was, my brother and my two friends, Laverne and Karen, we were always the four amigos going somewhere we shouldn't. And we were at Fast Night Park, and this old man came, and we started running. He said, come here. He said, you're welcome here now.
Oh.
So you had that, and I remember Mayer coming on as a kid, my mother sitting us down in front of the TV, that this isn't going to be another Little Rock. We're going to make this work. And you may know this, or you may not. I didn't until I was an adult, but the man who hired me as superintendent of schools in Columbia, Robert Shaw, later went on the South Central Accreditation Association. And he told me that Springfield was one of 10 models in the United States that made integration work. So you might want to go into that, because I didn't know it on a higher level. I just knew when I went to Columbia, Missouri, they were still dealing with stuff we'd already done. And then when I went to Chattanooga in the 80s, and Memphis in the 80s, they were still just starting to dealing with it.
Yes,
You know, right, exactly. So Springfield, I think, was unique in that matter.
Wow. We need to look that up.
We do.
Thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that. That's important. So, since this is a project about Route 66, just an opinion, and you may not even have one because it just wasn't in your experience, but do you think it was a big deal that Route 66 came through Springfield as far as music is concerned? Not so much looking back with nostalgia as so many people around the world do now.
Right.
But from the perspective of when it was still Route 66.
Well, I think that was our main route of transportation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people, that's where they, and then my brother and I've gone as kids. My dad lived in Santa Monica, and we go out in the summers, and we went Route 66
Did you?
to, Barstow, Arizona, and all those places. I know the song,
Right,
Oklahoma City and those kind of places. But I think having traveled it, you either had train or car. And I think for many African Americans, it was going to be car.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if you travel by car, you know where you can stop. My brother was just telling me this morning, my aunt and uncle would always stop going to Arkansas at the same service station. And my uncle sat there and nobody came out, and so he got out and put the gas in the car, and my brother gave my brother the money to go in to pay for it. And the guy was going to, my brother was 7 or 8, and he's going to give it to the man. He said, put it under that rock.
Mm.
You know, so I think to have that comfort of knowing you'd be safer,
Mm-hmm.
or you could go be treated like a human being, rather than if you got on a train, you had to go to the back, or somebody got on a bus, they moved you, you know, that kind of thing. So I think that mode of travel for African Americans then was a safer.
Was your dad consulting the Green Book, do you think?
Oh, I'm sure anybody in my
Yeah,
family. And I found one, I didn't know what it was, and I threw it away when my aunt died in 2012.
Uh-huh.
You know,
Yeah.
and then I found a book that had all the colored residents in Springfield, and their dresses and their names and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I have to ask, do you remember any music on Route 66 going to California?
No.
I had to ask. Because I know your dad was at least sensitive to music.
Right.
Yeah. Any other memories about, that's quite a road trip.
It was, well, and again, it was very, we didn't know it then, but they packed all this food because you weren't going to stop. And I just remember we'd go through Oklahoma, Texas. When we got to New Mexico, we would stop.
That's a pretty long distance,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yep. And because it was more amenable to people of other colors or creeds, you know, it wasn't like Oklahoma and Texas. And we could tell, I could just as a kid tell the difference in how they acted once they got there. It was like it was a relief.
Wow.
You know, and then getting to California where things were so much more progressive.
Yeah.
You know, and having relatives, of course, who had migrated there from the South before the war, you know, then after the war, and Chicago too, the same. Now I'm an adult, and knowing these things, seeing family in Chicago and in Detroit, and then in LA, that's why they were doing these things.
Curious, what were they doing in California? What kind of work were they doing?
Laborers, housekeepers. My dad was a right-hand man, Boy Friday to John Payne, who was a B actor, had a show named The Restless Gun, and he lived down the street from James Arness on Gunsmoke.
Yeah.
And so my dad would take the 3 boys, my brother and I, and one of their Payne's son, to Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm, and we did all these kind of things. And so as kids, that was just great. You know, and we weren't doing that in Springfield, Missouri, for sure.
Well, you didn't have anything close by.
Right,
They even
exactly.
Came close to
Exactly.
that, yeah.
Exactly.
That
But-
must have been like magic.
Yes, but as far as Route 66, just the experiences, you know, as a child, knowing there was a difference
Yeah. Yeah.
when you got to another part of the country,
Right.
or going to the South with my grandmother when my brother was telling me this morning that he remembers my uncle. He said, I'd never seen this. He went and got his camera. There were black and white kids in the pool together. He said, I never thought I'd live to see this.
Right.
You know, so so I'm at the age where I'm on the cusp of both of those experiences.
Yeah. If you were a club owner or a live music venue owner back in the day on Route 66, when it was still a numbered highway, would that have been important in Springfield to be located on that highway? You know, I often wonder, was it just important because you're close to downtown, or was it important to be on that road?
I think it's probably important to be on that road because it's the same thing with I-70 or I-44. If you're a business person, that's going to bring in business. You know, and I think black or white or yellow or green, you're going to travel. People are going to travel, and that's going to be the route, you know, that they would take.
Well, yeah, I mean, I thought it was fascinating that you talked about all the people, African-American people from the communities in the outlying areas coming into Springfield.
Right.
To shows. I'd not really thought about that too much, but I'd like to explore that whole story a little more at some point.
Because the sports teams would play, like Joplin would play.
Right, Springfield, and then
So
Kansas
you-
City, and, that,
Yeah.
and the Osho had teams,
Oh, yeah.
all of them, and, the high schools, the African-American high schools played each other.
Sure.
There was
that
always a
kind of thing.
Thanksgiving football game.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Wow. Do you think it improved the chances of getting big outside names to come to Springfield because Route 66 was here?
Oh, definitely,
Okay,
definitely.
yeah.
But definitely that, Route 66, and that you had an African-American community here.
Mm-hmm.
As, if you're traveling, to know that there's a place you can eat, there's a
Yeah.
place you can sleep. I've just read about Leontine Price, and George Shirley, two African-American opera singers, and their experiences in Atlanta. And his first experience in Atlanta, he went to this barber shop and they let him sit there, but they wouldn't cut his hair.
Mm-hmm.
And he's, one of the top tenors in the world, and then 10 years later he goes back and come on, sir, just, come right in,
Mm-hmm.
So just the differences of those times, and those classical singers knowing where to go,
Yeah.
if they were going to go, and being the general manager of the Met, I think it was Birmingham. The Met did these tours every year.
Mm-hmm.
And Atlanta was one of the tours, and Birmingham was one of the tours, and they said, Birmingham, you can't have any we can't accommodate the African American singers. He said, well, you won't accommodate the Metropolitan Opera, and they stopped going.
Yeah.
So
Leverage finally. Yeah.
right,
Mm-hmm.
right.
Yeah.
And I think where you have a big community, and Springfield was, for this area had the largest African American community.
Mm-hmm.
So I think also that would play into, it's just economics, and
Yeah, that's interesting because even though Springfield has an early 20th century legacy of being extremely hostile
right,
to African Americans, by the time the 60s and 70s come along, or early 70s come along, they feel perfectly comfortable.
well, and I think that's because the city fathers
Mm-hmm.
made a decision
Mm-hmm.
that we were going to make this work.
Why do you think they made that decision when other communities didn't?
I don't know. I mean, because it just had to be one of the things the underlying things I see is because of a high Christian base in the community.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you got to walk the walk or talk the talk.
Mm-hmm.
I know for me as a kid, Curtis March, a white minister at First Calvary,
Mm-hmm.
was very influential. I've been at his daughter's, all three of her kids' weddings. I felt like a part of their family. And he started a men's group in the 60s, church men to have breakfast, and was integrated.
What year would that have been?
It would have been in the mid-60s to the 70s.
Yeah.
And so and then he and my uncle became golf buddies. And he'd go to Hickory Hills, and they'd go here and there, making efforts. So I think there was that community.
Which uncle?
My uncle Paul
Okay.
Thomas Darton, my
Okay.
aunt, my father's sister's husband.
Okay.
And he was one of the, if you look into the history of the Community Youth Center, he was one of the founders of that.
Okay.
And was very civic-minded,
Yeah.
this group. And he and my mother's brother, Uncle Ralph, and my father's sister's husband had the first African-American cab company here, D&B
Yes.
Cab Company.
She found that too.
Okay.
I've got a photograph
Yes, we have
upstairs,
photographs.
right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I think there was a community, African-American and white, that wanted to make this, and you had people, the school teachers and people like that, who wanted to make it work.
Mhm.
And ministers who were educated who wanted to make it work, so.
You know,
It's
when-
quite different in Columbia,
Yes.
even at the same time.
Interesting.
I know it was started by the churches, the survey that I had sent you.
Yep.
In 53 or 54, just asking, do you serve African Americans? And they went through the whole town and asked.
Oh, wow.
We have that online too.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I think it stemmed from the churches.
That's what I think. And who was in leadership at that time that decided they were going to make this happen?
You know, I still think that's admirable because I can tell you, and you know, that there are plenty of places in the South where the churches were not helping at all.
Exactly.
They were part of the problem.
Right, exactly.
And so that's interesting here
Yeah.
that they were part of the solution.
Well, and I was amazed, and you'll understand this, to find out that the first integrated university in Georgia was the school in Macon, Georgia.
Uh-huh.
And what's that called? Mercer.
Mercer, yeah. Mercer
A Southern
University.
Baptist school.
A Southern Baptist school, yeah.
So that says again something about you're going to walk the walk.
Yeah.
But they were the first integrated college in Georgia.
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, we could go for
Right.
we could go for hours. So I'm going to ask you sort of a metaphorical question, and this is just obviously opinion. It is often said that Route 66 sort of consciously created an American culture of freedom and entertainment and tourism that was probably better recognized after it was decommissioned in 1985. But obviously not everybody had access to all of that freedom and entertainment and even tourism. Does that change the perspective of Route 66 for African Americans as opposed to?
I don't think it does because I think it's more, if you think about Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, how it changes and how the cultures change as you go through Route 66. It's not like being in Georgia or being in New York State. As you go through this journey, the cultures change.
Yeah.
And I think because of the varying cultures, and you weren't in southern mid-Texas, just at the top of Texas.
Right.
So I think it's because the cultures were more ecumenical or eclectic than if it were just one, where there's Native Americans, or people who had founded Oklahoma or Texas or whatever. I think if you look at, it's similar if you think about 70, where it goes across the country, how the cultures change as you go across
the west and
right. So I think, in my mind, that's why it was successful, because you had these different, cultures. And I think if you're traveling, as we were as kids, you stop and they've got these Native American things you want. Then you get these Spanish things, and you get food, and you get entertainment, that's quite different as you go on that route.
Yeah, it's such a long road from Chicago to California, to the coast.
Right.
That you're bound to find something you like.
Right.
And you certainly did. I mean, things stick in your mind from even that long ago. So.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I have to ask this one question, because I think this is, when you talked about opportunity and how you have to take advantage of the opportunity, is it true that you hurt your hand playing violin and that's how you started singing?
Yes. Yeah.
I just got to hear that story.
Well, I had tendonitis, and I couldn't play piano or violin, and my mother said, "Why don't you take some singing lessons?" And I said, "I can read music," which a lot of singers couldn't at that time, and I played for a lot, and I knew they couldn't count. I mean, it was so egotistical to think, well, I can do that. And then I had a teacher, and I didn't practice. I'd practice before my lesson, and she figured it out. Then music all of a sudden got harder. Because I was just doing it till my hand got better. And then it turned out, again, it's one of those God things, you know, it changed my whole life.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of thing.
That's a
And
great story.
when I learned I had to work and how hard I had to work, but again, it wasn't planned. And that's when I, again, working with students, you know, again, do the best you can at whatever you're doing. Because you don't know what you're going to be doing now. You know, and I've seen, you know, my students I've taught now are in their late 60s, and some are turning 70, because they were just 5 years old, younger, when I started teaching. And what they thought they were going to do and what they're really doing is quite different. A kid who goes from Hickman High School and I'm going to be a great trombone player and takes a German class in college, then goes to Germany and plays trombone in an orchestra, and then marries a woman from England and adopts a child from China. Then they come back to the States and he's doing translations for major companies. But still plays his trombone. But that one German class
Yeah.
can made the difference.
I bet you've got great stories about some of your students
Yeah.
and what they've gone on to do.
Yep, and not, you know, again, it's not a straight path.
Yeah.
It's being prepared in whatever you're going to do, and being prepared to change.
We could do a whole other interview just
Oh.
exploring that. Anything that I didn't cover that you think?
Well, I'd heard that Billie Holiday was in Springfield.
Yes,
Okay.
I only know that from my
I
uncle.
was gonna say, you would have been very young at the
Right.
time. Yeah.
I wasn't even born.
Okay. See,
Right.
it's hard to pinpoint when she was here because it's not in the papers.
Right, and I only know it through oral.
Okay, that's Ora Logan's grandchildren.
Okay.
Or, sorry, her children. We've been talking with
Okay,
them.
okay.
And so we have all of Alberta's materials.
Oh, neat,
Yes.
neat. Well, I only knew that from my uncle.
Okay, yeah.
You know, that-
Liz thinks she remembers reading the book that was signed.
Oh,
So
wow.
I was thinking it was 56, but it sounds like it was much earlier.
Well, it could have been, you know. And
It's-
of course, I was, you know, you're a kid, you don't pay any attention to those
Yeah.
kinds of things that you should.
Yeah,
But if you know, it's
56,
not-
you would have been really young then.
Right.
I think that's when the book came out, and we thought maybe there was an association there, but I think she probably would have toured earlier, so.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Anything else?
Not right now, I'm sure I'll think of things
I'm
later.
sure you could come back and we could do this all over again.
Yeah.
Okay.
And never cover a foot that we covered today, I'm quite sure.
Well, thank you both. This
Thank
is
you so
wonderful.
much for doing
Thank
this
you.
for us. It's been wonderful.